So, welcome everybody. I'm going to talk about Microsoft Teams governance. Of course, thanks to the sponsors for making this event possible. Yeah, well, I'm not going to read this whole thing. Just in general, just be nice to each other. I think that covers it all. So, yeah, I don't think it should be an issue for this for the conference and the people who are watching. Yeah, so that's me and my big face. So my name is Jasper Oosterveld. I work as a modern workplace consultant for Inspark. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP, and my focus in my daily work and of course also in the community is around governance, compliance, and Microsoft Teams. And I live in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. So that's also the reason you see me walking under the stairs, because space is limited if you're not a millionaire.
Jesper, I have to break in because it seems your microphone is not working correctly, and it's very quiet, very low volume.
Yeah, I'm gonna change it. Here we go. Audio. Yeah, is this better?
This is much better. Yes.
Okay. So do I have to repeat my lame jokes? No, I will save those. Yeah. So okay. So again, just break in if it's not good, but I think this one should work. Yeah, I'm still waiting for another cable for my microphone on my desk. So that is wonderful. So let's continue. Yeah. So how can you set up a successful governance strategy? We do this in 3 steps. So again, feel free to use this within your own company or with your customers. Slides will also become available after the session. So again, we do it in 3 steps. We start with a workshop. Then we define a governance strategy. And last but not least, you also need to implement your strategy. So, but before I do that, when I talk to my customers, I always do a little bit of an introduction with Microsoft Teams. Of course, it's been around for many years now, but that doesn't mean that every customer or every employee is really familiar with Teams and what it is and what it can do. Don't worry, I'm not going to bother you with a demo and show you how you can create a channel and stuff like that. That is something I do show customers, of course, but for time purposes, I will skip that part. But what I do, I start with this introduction, basically giving a summary what Teams is and what the pillars are of Teams. So the first one, of course, is chat. And with chat, it's just personally, I find it a more informal, a more fun way of communicating with each other. And it will also reduce the amount of emails you get, because you don't need to send an email for every question you have. And these days, it's also easier to involve external people within your Teams. So that can also save you up emails you're sending towards your customers, for example. Yeah, and I often also talk about how it can stimulate a more informal culture. But especially in Netherlands, that's not really a business case, because we're pretty informal people anyway. But maybe in the country where you live and work, that is something that needs some attention. And that is something, for example, the management is wanting to implement. That's definitely a good way to do. So the second one is Meet. Yeah, so of course, there's having meetings. Online meetings where you can share your screen, where you, for example, can work together in whiteboard. Soon Microsoft is releasing an update where all the information of your meetings, especially if it's a recurring meeting, is gathered in one central place. So you can see meeting notes, potential recordings, all the participants. So that definitely makes your meetings a lot more efficient and effective. The third one, I always skip, but I have to mention it, but this is one is really aimed at like the call center functionality. So something that was Skype for Business was used for many years, like the whole PBX stuff. I'm not even going to pretend that I know anything about that, but I have to mention it because it is a part of Microsoft Teams. Next one, of course, again, no surprise, is collaboration. So being able to collaborate with your colleagues, but of course also with external people, for example, your suppliers or your customers, or yeah, maybe some other external entity. And automate, that's of course the integration of business processes within Microsoft Teams. And for example, yeah, what we do internally within Inspark, well, not at the moment because everybody's working from home, but when we still worked at the office, you could participate in company lunch, but you have to pay for it, and I believe that's more because of tax reasons. But there is a bot that recognizes if you're in the office. It sends you a message around 1 o'clock. And it says, hey, I've seen you've been at the office. Have you participated in lunch? So then it's the honorary system. So yeah, they assume everybody's honest. I think everybody is, otherwise it's a bit lame. So if I say yes, there's a signal sent to another system called AVAS. And yeah, I think it's more of a Dutch system. Maybe in Belgium it's also familiar. But that system registers it, and it automatically deducts it from my salary. And this process used to be done manually. So again, this saves the employee had to do it manually time, so she can focus now on more important tasks. And yeah, it just saves a lot of time and money. It's just one example, but you can do a lot more with that. And I believe there are multiple sessions around this topic anyway. So definitely check those out. So then normally I do a demo. Sorry, and normally I do a demo. And then basically I use this slide as a summary of what I've talked about, the slide before in the demo, to really show people that with Teams, you do have really a nice centralized experience where you don't have to switch that much between applications. Because what I noticed personally for myself is that you can focus a lot better when you just work into one application. You don't have to switch that much between, browser, another application, your mail, and just very distracting. So Teams definitely helps with that. And I know this is a little bit of a marketing term, but I do notice an increase in productivity because I don't have to switch that much, and I notice it with customers as well. I do find it hard to pinpoint a percentage, but it definitely helps. And of course, there's still a lot of customers who are trying to stimulate and enhance like a digital transformation within their company, so they can use cloud services, innovate quicker, use the latest features and updates. Well, Teams is a cloud application, right? So that automatically helps as well, setting a right step into that direction. And last but not least, your data is, of course, compliant and secure within the data centers of Microsoft. But it doesn't mean, I mean, there's a difference what happens if the data is on your device, right? Once that's the case, it's not Microsoft responsibility anymore. So let's say an employee loses a phone or a laptop, you cannot like complain to Microsoft saying like, hey, we lost valuable data. They're like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But yeah, there's not much we can do about that. That's where a lot of services are available. For example, classification, data loss prevention, retention policies. I'll touch upon that a little bit later in the session. But I just want to emphasize how important that aspect is as well when you work with Teams. But it's something you have to do. So Microsoft provides the tools, but you have to implement them. So then I also ask my customers a lot. So, hey, you've seen me talk about Teams, you've seen a demo of Teams. What are some of the worries you have when you are going to implement this? Or maybe you already implemented it, and what are your worries around that implementation? Again, what I noticed, I've asked this a lot. But I noticed there are now basically like 6 or 7 bullet points that come back all the time. So one of these is a Teams explosion. There's I think a real worry that if Teams is implemented, there's an explosion of Teams. There are going to be dozens, maybe hundreds of Teams, and it will just become very hard to manage. This is a very realistic worry, because if I'm in Teams and I can just create a team by myself and I call it marketing, and another colleague does it too, Teams doesn't tell you, hey, wait a minute, there is already a team called marketing, so we'll just create another one. That's lovely. So what will happen is you can maybe have 5 teams that all are created for the same purpose, and then eventually nobody really knows which one to use anymore. Especially if there's not really a proper naming convention / policy, it can be difficult to know what the team is being used for or what should be used for. That's difficult for employees, but definitely also for IT to manage. Search is being improved within Teams. It's not there yet, but they announced it at Ignite. But for now, it's not that easy to find teams. Like we have expert teams. So let's say there's an expert team called compliance, but if I search for compliance, it's not going to find it. So let's say you have a self-service scenario implemented where everybody can create a team. Yeah, there's a risk that people just create a new one because they can't find it. Well, the complexity is, the first time I heard it, I was kind of surprised, but then I talked with the customer about it and I kind of understand it. If you create a new team, you do get a lot of questions that are not always clear for a non-technical employee. Do you want to base it on Microsoft 365 group? Most people don't even know what it is. So the whole creation process is being improved, and especially with the arrival of Teams templates, it's becoming a bit easier, but it still can be quite complex. Well, this is the last one, and this one is very valid, especially these days when everybody works from home. Yeah, there's the risk of a data leak. People can, by accident, maybe add like sensitive information in a chat, or they share a sensitive document. Maybe that team is being shared with an external person, and that external person can just download all the files and then can share it with people who should not see that content. Again, something we'll address in this session. If you have any questions, by the way, you can just drop them in Discord, and I will go over them at the end of the session. I turned Discord off because it was doing pop-ups, so it's a bit distracting. But definitely drop your questions in Discord. So what happens if you don't address these worries? Again, this won't be very surprising, but of course it can result in failed user adoption. Right? People get irritated, they don't know how it works, and then what it could result in teams not being used at all, and it would be a huge shame. And the second one is, of course, is more the IT aspect. It'll become very hard to manage all the teams and the whole team's rollout in general. That results in IT needing a lot of time to do that, and that will maybe take away time from other valuable tasks they have. So why is, maybe you already kind of see why governance is important, but this again is a little bit of a summary as well. So first of all, it is very important when you set up a governance strategy that you involve two audiences, so IT and the business. And why should you do that? Well, there are a couple of reasons. It will prevent a lot of miscommunication and frustration down the line if you start to implement teams. These two audiences don't always have an understanding of each other's requirements, responsibilities, and worries. So if you bring them together from the start, you can talk about those things, and believe me, they will definitely help with your implementation and long-term rollout and usage of teams. Well, the second one is that you do contribute to successful adoption. So my advice always is, don't only do governance, also do adoption. And don't only do adoption and don't do governance. You have to do them both. And of course, adoption is all aimed at making sure teams is used the way it should be used and the way you want to use it, so people have benefit from using it. But in your governance strategy, you make decisions that impact your adoption part. For example, maybe you are setting up a system where people have to apply to you to create a team. So you have to make sure people understand how that works. Teams owners, that's often a role that's assigned to employees. They need to understand the responsibilities they have that comes with that role. Just a couple examples. Maybe you have some internal procedures and you maybe need to apply to some regulations, maybe within your country or the European Union or maybe outside. If you just turn on Teams, I'm 100% certain this will become an issue, because Teams doesn't know what regulations you have to follow or what internal procedures you have. So let's say you just turn on Teams, everybody can add an external app from the App Store. And there's so many apps in there. And like, I think 90% have no idea what it is or what it can do. And it could be fine, but it can also be a risk. And maybe people start to chat or upload documents with BSN numbers, or like social security numbers, or maybe IBAN numbers. And that's something that maybe is not allowed. So that can create maybe some serious issues for your company. So that's something you need to think about as well. And last but not least, now Microsoft Teams is of course part of Microsoft 365 groups. And when you create a team, a lot happens, right? It's not just a team. You get a planner, you still get a group in Stream, Power BI can be connected, you get a team site in SharePoint, there's what is it? A shared calendar is created, a shared inbox. So a lot is happening. So two sides. One side, IT, they need to understand what the impact is and what that means for their administration part. And of course, the business needs to know how they should work and how they can work with those tools that are also enabled once you create a team. So, well, when that's done, we do a workshop. And the workshop I always do in 2 hours. And the first part is just going over the topics that need to be addressed. And then there's a follow-up session in a couple weeks where all these topics ideally have all the information we need. We can make a decision and then we can move forward. But again, I can't go into all of these topics because of the time I have. But you need to set up a scope. So what's the scope of your Microsoft Teams governance? Mostly this is always enabling collaboration internally, externally. Well, the second one is, what are your vision and goals of the organization of using Teams? And this you can use within your adoption strategy or reuse if you already defined it there. But this is what you use to basically convince and communicate towards your towards the business, right? To the I don't like the word end user anymore. I think Benjamin Nyland kind of ruined that for me, because he said one time end users are kind of like drug addicts. So since he said that, every time I say end users, that just kind of brings that back to me. So let's say just employees. Well, let's say you set up a whole strategy. You need to have a group of people who make sure people comply to the strategy, and that the strategy is also updated, because the world changes, teams changes. So yeah, let's say you finalize a strategy on Monday. A couple months from down the line, there's going to be new functionalities. Maybe there's something else happened within your company or outside the company that impacts your rollout of teams. So that needs to be updated. Roles and responsibilities. So these vary from administrator roles, so like who's the global admin, what are the responsibilities, to what are the responsibilities of owners and teams, members, guests. And last but not least, you also need to address what departments are connected to this rollout and usage of teams, and what are their overall responsibilities. And this is mainly aimed to prevent miscommunication again down the line, so people don't know, okay, who is actually responsible for this task? Oh, well, we wrote that down, so this is the person, or this is the department. This is one we'll dive more into, so skip that. You also need to talk about and discuss what are some of the procedures that impact the usage of teams. So these vary from how do you make sure when somebody starts within your business that they get a license, they're added to the team. Let's say they leave your company. How do we make sure the license is deactivated, maybe some data secured, etc., etc. And the last one, of course, is new features and updates. Unfortunately, Teams is not part of the first release principle or target release. It's the same thing, always mix them up. That said, there are other options to know what's happening with Teams. And one of the main ones is the message center in the Office 365 admin center. So I highly recommend taking a look at that at least once a week, especially these days, because it goes really fast. So what are some of the workload topics you need to discuss? Also, a whole list. I'm sorry that you have to go over it. I know it looks maybe a bit tedious, maybe a bit long, but it is very important that you do that, especially to guarantee a successful rollout and long-term usage of Teams. So we'll start with collaboration templates. Because Teams is often used for multiple purposes, right? But in Teams, if you create a team, it's just a team, right? But you need to define with your customer, how do you want to use Teams? For what kind of collaboration purposes? So you define your templates. I just wrote down 4. These are the most common ones. But I do advise to keep it simple and small. Don't define 10, because it will increase the complexity. So start with a couple. Once you've done this, then all the follow-up slides basically have to be applied to each template. Yeah, I'll probably repeat that a couple times. So you need to think about, do we need to have a naming convention or a naming policy for these templates? Well, this is optional. You don't have to do this. I'll give you an example with one of our customers that they had to do it because for them it made sense. There are 2 things basically you can do. The first one is that you can add, for example, an abbreviation and then the name of the team. Well, you see an example here. Or maybe you want to change the SharePoint URL. Well, that part only works at provisioning. So if you want to set up an URL like that, you have to use some sort of provisioning solution. You can create your own, or you can acquire one. A couple options. Unfortunately, it's not ideal. You have an Azure AD naming policy where you can add a prefix and/or a suffix and combine it with a profile property or add a word. Again, sounds complex. It is sort of complex and it doesn't really work. And I'll tell you a little bit later why, but it is an option. Of course, and this is a very common one, you can connect it to a provisioning solution, and then you can apply that example I gave in the previous slide. If you go more for a self-service scenario, and that, again, and that's something I'll touch upon a little bit later, you can always leave it up to the employees. You don't have to do it. There's no obligation. There's certain, not always the customer has a requirement where this is needed, so don't feel obligated to do it. Yeah, that's it. You don't have to do it. So what are some of the advantages and challenges? It does improve, especially now, the findability. Again, I don't know once the search results are improved if that's still the case, but for now, this definitely helps. I have, in my personal opinion, there are more challenges. So especially if you want to apply that Azure AD policy, I still haven't seen one customer using it. And I asked around when we were still seeing each other at conferences, not many people have. Because it requires an up-to-date AD. And it's hard to combine one policy that addresses all these, let's say, 4 collaboration templates. Can't really use one word that kind of covers them all. Yeah, and this one is not a shocker either. If you leave it up to employees, they'll just forget. And then they don't want to do it on purpose. It's not like they're trying to annoy you, maybe some people, but in general, they'll just forget, you know, in kind of the heat of the moment when they're creating a team. Yeah, so what is my advice? Only apply when it's really necessary. Don't feel obligated of doing it, and just discuss it internally with your customer if it's needed. So we had a local district that has an Office 365 tenant, and they shared with multiple other local districts and some external companies. So for them, it made a lot of sense to set up a naming policy. So their naming policy started with the name of the district or the company. So for IT, who was managing the tenant, it was very clear who that team belonged to. So that was a great example where I was like, yeah, you definitely should apply a naming policy convention. It's just simple. I'm just going to keep talking. This is the hard part of doing these online sessions. I have no idea how many people there are, if people can still hear me. I'm expecting Martin to jump in if you cannot hear me. But what are some external access options? Very straightforward. You can allow it for all templates. You can allow it for a selection, or you can disable it. And these days, you can also connect it to a sensitivity label. A little bit more about that later. So what are some of the advantages? It definitely reduces shadow IT, because especially these days, everybody needs to collaborate with an external person. This is just very common. And I think most of the times this is the case. So you can turn it off, but people will find a different way with all the problems that include with that working like that. It's definitely more an efficient way of collaborating because, you don't have to send emails, for example, with attachments. You can just work together in a team. Some challenges, especially if you start collaborating with external people, compliance becomes very crucial because, of course, you need to add an external person to your team. But let's say if nothing else in place, that external person could download sensitive files and just spread them around because there's nothing blocking that by default. And that's where data classification and DLP are very important. And more about that later. That said, there is an increased responsibility for owners because owners are the only ones who can add external people in the team. So that's where the adoption part kicks in, where you communicate and train people who are going to take up the owner role. What is my advice? I will definitely advise to turn it on for all teams, and then people start to worry when I say that. There are some ways to, you have to, of course, have to manage it. There are some ways to do that. There's something called Azure Access Reviews. That is part of a more expensive license. That's the Azure AD P2 license, where you can create a review, and where, for example, you define the review period. For example, you say every month, the owners of these teams, you have to add these teams, have to review the membership, and it can be only guests or everybody. And that means they'll get an email, and then they can decide to maybe kick out sounds so negative, but maybe, let's say kick out a couple external people out of the team, but it can also be internal people. You can also create your own solution to do that as well, something simpler. There's always a social control aspect because people will notice that an external person is added because it will say bracket guest behind somebody's name. So people can be like, hey, why are these external people being added to your team? You need to educate your team owners of the responsibility. And definitely start with a project defining your data classification and DLP strategy. I do always advise my customers to do this separately, because if you do this also within this workshop, the scope will kind of explode and will take a lot longer to implement your strategy. So often we just take like a note in the strategy, like in a Word document, often saying like, this is being set up while we're writing this document, something like that. Or maybe a customer already has this, and then you can just refer to it and then integrate it within your strategy. But setting up from the ground just takes too much time. Expiration policy. So with expiration policy, you can basically automatically delete inactive teams. And there are a couple options. You can apply it to all teams, selection of teams, and none. Again, it's very straightforward. These days, it's been around for maybe like a year or something. There's a nice thing is there's something called an activity check. Because beforehand, owners of teams that were being used also got this email saying like, hey, do you want to delete this team? And they're like, well, why am I getting this email? I'm using this on a daily basis. So to prevent that, there's an activity check. And it checks for basically if documents are being used within SharePoint and if people are actually opening a channel. If that happens, the expiration policy doesn't kick off. It will just renew it. So let's say you set a policy of a year or 6 months. It will check before that 6-month period if there's any activity. If it is, it will extend the time frame again with another 6 months. If a team is not being used, it will send an email to the owners 30 days before that 6-month period expires, asking them if they want to, I don't think they call it delete, but archive the team or whatever, one of the two. And what it will do, if they say yes, it will move it to a recycle bin where it will stay for 30 days. And after those 30 days, it will be definitely deleted. If they renew it, renews it for another 6 months. If they don't respond, 15 days later, another email, and then a day before another email, and after that, it will automatically be removed. It will keep your tenant clean, right? It will remove inactive teams, you can have inactive teams, but there are a lot of customers who like to keep it clean, so to speak. And it does reduce a lot of manual labor for IT because they don't have to go over all the inactive teams. They can just let the policy do it. Of course, there's some challenges. If a team is gone, it's gone, and I'll address that in a couple slides when I talk about backup. A huge responsibility for owners because they have to reply to that email. So again, it's an important task within your adoption strategy to also include this part, if you're using expiration policy, of course. Something we'll discuss as well is retention, because what can happen is that maybe there is an inactive team, but it does include content that needs to be archived, for example, that has to be, or that cannot be deleted, right? So you need to do something with retention. So we'll touch upon it later as well. I advise to just turn it on for a year and then evaluate after a certain amount of time if that's sufficient, or maybe you need to bring it back to 6 months, but maybe start with a year. Apply your retention policies, more about it later. Backup and restore. So there are a couple of options Microsoft provides that you can, for now, you cannot change. It's just the way it is.
Battery high.
Sorry. So your teams are stored for 30 days in a recycle bin. And after those 30 days, it's permanently deleted. Channels are stored for 30 days in a recycle bin and a channel recycle bin, and the owners of a team can restore it. Content is stored for 93 days in a recycle bin. That's a part of SharePoint. And videos are stored for 30 days in a recycle bin and stream. Maybe you are aware that Microsoft is changing some stuff around the storage of recordings of meetings. Those are not going to be stored in Stream anymore, but they will go to SharePoint or OneDrive. So then this will change for those kind of recordings to also the 93 days. So that's nice. So what do I advise? I advise to review the default options from Microsoft and then check them with your regulations or internal procedures or agreements and to see if that's sufficient. For most customers, it is. Once in a while, I meet a customer who says that's not sufficient. So that's helpful. So they need to take a deeper look at this. And there are a lot of third-party vendors who offer backup solutions. I've seen 8.1, so that's the reason I included it. But I would just advise to look into the market, what other options there are. I believe you have Barracuda and Veeam as well. Just take a look at a couple and then make a decision for yourself if it matches your requirements and if you like the vendor and you trust them with your data as well. Again, but one advice is to definitely look into retention and set up some retention policies to prevent that data is accidentally deleted. So privacy. Couple options again. The team can be private, so that means that the owners are the ones who can invite people. We have to invite people to become a member. Or public, that basically means everybody can become a member. All the content is visible. People can search for it and they can find it. And the last one is org-wide. I believe there's a maximum of 5 that you can make org-wide. It will add all the all employees automatically, sort of like a Yammer functionality. I haven't really seen it being used yet. So the main ones are always the first 2. I advise to do it open by default, because I always want people to stimulate knowledge sharing, to find content easier. That said, there are of course teams that cannot be open by default, for maybe the management team, the board of directors, HR. In that case, you just say, okay, this team has to be private. Owners can always change this, right? They can only do that if a sensitivity label is not being used. When you use a sensitivity label that enforces a team to be private, you cannot go back to public or vice versa. Now, a little bit more later about that topic. Here we are. So sensitivity labels. So there are a couple of options you can do by using a label. And traditionally, sensitivity labels being used to classify content. So, for example, I could have classified this presentation as highly sensitive, and what happens is once I do that, a couple actions can kick off depending on the configuration. Where this slide is, for example, only available for InSpark employees. So it can be shared externally by accident or on purpose, but that person cannot open it because it's not a part of our company. It's not being extended to be used with Microsoft 365 groups, so teams. So you can say, if this label is applied, this team is public or private, and you cannot switch back. Guest access are allowed or blocked. This one is now in preview. I hope they will release it in general availability this year. But you can also set the type of external sharing that's allowed. You can share with anyone, new and existing guests, new and existing only, or no external sharing at all. This is in preview. And the last one is a little bit of an overlap with conditional access in Intune. But for example, you can block access to the content for unmanaged devices. Or you can just offer the browser functionality only, or you can just offer the full functionality so that people can use their own Office apps, for example. If you go into this topic, definitely talk with the person or the department that's responsible for Intune or conditional access, so you don't interfere with each other's policies, so to speak. And a label for a team doesn't apply to the content. So let's say you assign a label called highly sensitive to your team. It doesn't mean that the content is also labeled with that highly sensitive label. It's 2 separate things. What does this look like? Well, these days you can do a nice split between using a label only for groups and sites, or only for files and emails, or so for both, or just one or the other. So now you can create labels just for teams. So that's pretty cool. Then here you set up the protection settings. So that's just what I showed you in the slide. So this is just what it looks like. Here you set the unmanaged devices. So let's say apply a label called project. You can see in the example, I can only select a private privacy option. I cannot add any external people. I don't like this error message. It would be nice if it says you're trying to add an external person, but the company policies prevent this. But now it's just a bit unclear. So for the end user, for the employee, he or she doesn't really know, is this my fault it's not working, or so that I wish they improve that. And this is what it could look like if you're trying to access it with an unmanaged device. So I advise to combine this with self-service creation. So you allow your employees to create a team and then assign a label. Definitely implement this define and implement in a separate project. Like I mentioned before, this is can be time consuming, can require additional resources, so that can make your Microsoft Teams workshop scope kind of explode. But you definitely have to do it. So DLP. So DLP is data loss prevention. And with data loss prevention, you can prevent, the name says it, you can prevent the sharing of sensitive information For example, a credit card number or a social security number, or you can define your own sensitive information. Maybe it's just related to one type of project. Let's say there's a project called Project Falcon. This is an example Microsoft uses. Every time that word is being used, you can apply your DLP policy, for example. This can be for chat, but can also be for content. That's this one. So it can be both, either or both. Yeah. If you want to use it for chat, you do need an E5 license, unfortunately. Yeah, for content you don't, but for chat you do. It's probably like an upsell from Microsoft. So this is what it looked like. So let's say I create a Word document within Office Online, and add an IBAN number. Immediately the policy kicks off, and it gives me a policy tip. Let's say I upload a document or automatically save it within a library from my local Word client, Word app. I get a nice little red icon. If I go to the details, it says it's blocked because of a policy in your organization. I can view the policy tip, and the text you see here, you can define yourself, and you can allow your employees to override it because maybe the policy is triggered when it shouldn't have been triggered. Or they can also report it, saying like, hey, for some reason this is triggered and I don't understand why. And those reports are sent to a central location that can be, for example, accessed by a CISO, for example, or somebody responsible for the policies. This is what it looks like with chat. Very similar. You get the same message. Yeah, that's what it looks like. So I advise to match your regulations and internal procedures with the usage of Microsoft Teams. And if you look at those, then you can decide, yes, we need to implement a DLP policy, or policies. Can be multiple, of course. You need to do a lot of testing. Let me check on the time. Yeah, should be good. You need to do a lot of testing because, as you see in the examples, this does impact your employees, because they can, if they're not aware, you know, oh, sorry, I'm such an idiot. That's the next one. The reason you need to test is because DLP doesn't always work the way expected to work. I used it with a customer who on paper didn't have really complicated requirements, but again, when we implemented it, it didn't really work out the way we expected it to work. So please do a lot of testing. So you're almost 100% certain your DLP policies work. This is the education part. As you've seen in the examples, yeah, there are error messages. People can do override and report. So you need to do something about communication and training when you start using DLP. And again, just like the data for classification, define it in a separate project. So now we move on to retention. Very straightforward. This is just aimed at retaining, and the word says it, retaining a chat, for example, or content. So making sure it cannot be changed or deleted for X amount of periods. So it can be days, months, or years. You can also say, hey, I want it to be deleted after an X amount of period, or people can change it, that's fine. But after say 6 months, this content or this chat has to be deleted. For now, I believe this is still the case. Chat retention for chat in private channels is not supported. For content, it is. So that part is fine. This advice is exactly the same as with DLP, because yeah, it's just a similar. It's a different kind of functionality, but these are again the same things you have to do. Do we have to apply to internal procedures? Are there certain regulations? For example, I believe resumes for employees that are not joining the company, I believe they have to be deleted after 3 to 6 months. So that, for example, can be a retention policy you can create and apply. You need to do testing, so you make sure it works. Educate your employees, and yeah, again, set it up in a separate project. So now we end up at the creation process. So I do this last because all these topics I just discussed, they basically decide if you go for a self-service scenario or for a provisioning scenario. So again, there are a couple options. You can, of course, allow all employees to use the Teams application. So maybe through the Windows 10 application or the browser to create a team. You can do the same thing, but then just for a selection of people. Or you do it more in a controlled manner, with or without an approval process, but using a provision solution. Again, for a selection of employees or for all employees. There's not really a right or wrong. It just really depends on the requirements, and a couple things impact those requirements. There's some kids going up and down the stairs. It's definitely not annoying. So again, it depends. Are you working with collaboration templates / formats? Because let's say you just want to use Teams for Teams. Yeah, you don't really have to do that, right? But again, if you use those 4 examples I use, yeah, you're often bound to a provisioning solution. Although these days there's something called Teams templates that's being rolled out as we speak, where you could create your own templates. And then if you just wanted to use templates, for like those for projects, departments, and that's it, that could work. Then you don't have to look at a provisioning solution. But let's say you want to use unique naming policies, you're already bound to a provisioning solution. If they're really strict external access policies that you can't really cover with manual use or the labels, you're often bound to a provisioning solution. If there's a different variation of external expiration policies, often you're stuck to that as well. So no, that's that part. But then you also need to take a look at some settings from Teams, because Teams has an admin center that has a lot of settings that impact all the underlying teams. Don't worry, can go over all of them. I'll just pick a couple. You need to look at your policies. So for example, who is allowed to create private channels? Is everybody allowed to do that, or just a selection of people? What are your messaging policies? So for example, are people allowed to edit their own messages? Are owners of a team allowed to delete all the messages, right? Can you use the fun stuff, the giffies, the smiles, etc.? And maybe do you want to enable read policies, where you can see if somebody read your message? Side note, you can turn it off manually as well as an employee. Almost said user again. Apps, do you want to allow all apps? So these are the Microsoft apps like Planner, OneNote, etc. Or do you want to enable that store where you have like 1 million apps? You can allow all of them, you can block all of them, or you can allow specific ones. What we always advise and see is to allow all Microsoft ones, then evaluate if you are already using external apps, allow those and block the rest. Do you want to allow tagging? So you can use tags within Teams. You can assign a tag to a selection of people. So if that tag is used, only those people get a notification. Or you can also say only the owners create a tag, or everybody create a tag. And do you want to use third-party file storage? And it basically means that if you're in a Teams application, you go to Files, you can allow people to enable their own Dropbox or Box or etc. I think I've seen that once being used, and that customer basically used it to allow people to import stuff from their Box, I think it was Box or Dropbox, into Teams, into their OneDrive. So that could be a scenario. That's fine. Let's see. A couple more minutes. We're good. We're almost there. So then again, if you go over these topics, you need to get an agreement upon all of them. We still add them in a document. You can also do it in a PowerPoint presentation, or maybe in SharePoint pages. Just what fits your company or for your customers. It's fine. Just long as you add it somewhere. I always present them. So I present the key findings of the strategy. Then we finalize it. There's also a review process going on. But after a while, it's like, okay, now we need to, this is our strategy. We need to finalize it on this date. And then you need to implement it, because often there's some settings that has to be changed, like the policies are described. Maybe you want to turn off the third-party apps. And often there's an implementation of a governance solution for provisioning. The provision point can be used. 8-point is one. There are many, many other ones as well. You can create your own. We also have our own application, our own self-service. Our own provisioning solution. We have that. And of course, you can also say, if you want to go more for the self-service scenario, there's something called from ShareGate Apricot that's more aimed at that, where they can help you out implementing that and making sure that some of your rules are implemented. It's a nice solution as well. So thanks for attending. What I can do now, maybe I can take a look. I don't know if Marta is still there. I hope he is. Otherwise, I've been talking to the computer for nothing.
Yes,
but then maybe I can go. Yeah? Oh, okay.
I'm still here. Yes. Thanks very much, Jasper. And there are a couple of questions. In particular, there are some questions about examples about vision, goals, steering committee, roles and responsibilities. And that's maybe a bit too big of a topic to discuss here in the couple of minutes that we have left. So I would like to encourage you to go to the Discord channel and have a look there. Another question that we got is, do you have some examples perhaps for these provisioning platforms that you talked about?
Yeah, I will add that as well in the channel. There's a couple ones. Yeah.
All right. And another question that came up: is it a good idea to purpose retention as a replacement for some of the classic backup scenarios, so that you use retention instead of backup?
Yeah, that's very important to realize that retention is not a backup, because with backup you can go back in a certain amount of period of time. Like you say, I want to restore that content or that site from like 6 months ago. Retention doesn't do that. Like, retention does prevent certain stuff to be deleted, but it's not a backup. It's important to understand that. So don't try to use it as a backup solution.
Yeah. All right, excellent. And the small jiffy that Bram posted here is when we heard your kids running on the stairs. So,
well, I did a session last week or something like that for in I think it was Portugal, and they were playing outside. They came in like crying. So it didn't happen. So it's not too bad. So there's some improvement.
Well, it's all accepted nowadays, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, Jasper.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay, go have a look at the Discord channel if you want to. I think a lot of interaction there. So really, I'd like to thank the attendees as well. And yeah, thanks, and have a great day, man. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you too. Appreciate it. Thanks. Bye.
The Omita framework is an enterprise-ready software platform that makes it possible to set up an easy integration between your existing back-office applications and push all the relevant information into digital workplaces. Omita has developed various kinds of solutions which can be easily deployed and linked to your back-office applications. Omita has solutions for contract management, HR to speed up onboarding and offboarding processes, sales dashboards, shop floor portals, and many more. If you want more information, visit our website.